A black single father loses a brutal custody battle for his daughter, but when a hidden document surfaces, the shocking truth behind the fight is revealed, changing everything in an instant. What dark secrets will be exposed, and who will come out on top? The courtroom buzzed with hushed whispers and nervous glances as James Carter, a hard-working single father, sat at the defendant's table, his heart pounding in his chest. The walls felt like they were closing in around him, and the cold, clinical atmosphere of the room didn't help. He looked over at his 8-year-old daughter, Sophie, who sat quietly with her mother, Rebecca, on the opposite side of the courtroom. Sophie's wide, innocent eyes met his, and for a brief moment, James saw a flicker of hope. But it vanished as Rebecca shifted in her seat, breaking the gaze between father and daughter. James had been fighting for months to keep joint custody of Sophie. The divorce had been difficult, but he had always believed that despite their differences, he and Rebecca could find common ground when it came to their daughter. But as the custody battle dragged on, it became clear that Rebecca had no intention of sharing. She wanted Sophie all to herself. Rebecca had the upper hand. Her family had money, and her new lawyer, Brad Stevens, was ruthless. He had spent the last few weeks twisting every part of James's life, painting him as unstable, unfit, and unreliable. Brad had even dragged up a teenage arrest, an incident where James had been wrongly accused of shoplifting. The charges had been dropped, but the record had left a stain on his life that Brad now used to make him look like a criminal. "Your Honor," Brad's voice cut through the courtroom like a knife. "This man has shown time and time again that he cannot provide the stability and financial security that a child like Sophie needs. He has a record of poor decisions, and with his unstable job situation, it is clear that granting full custody to Mrs. Rebecca Carter is in the best interest of the child." James clenched his fists under the table, trying to keep calm. His lawyer, Dana Wallace, had warned him not to react, no matter how provoked he felt. Dana was good. She genuinely believed in James and had fought hard for him. But she was working with limited resources, and it was clear that Brad Stevens had stacked the deck against them. "Your Honor," Dana said, standing and addressing the judge, "Mr. Carter is a dedicated father who has always put his daughter's well-being first. Yes, his financial situation is not as strong as Mrs. Carter's, but he has maintained steady employment, and more importantly, he has a close, loving relationship with Sophie. To take that away from him would be devastating for both father and daughter." The judge, an older man with tired eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, glanced between James and Rebecca before speaking. "I've reviewed the evidence presented by both parties," he began, his tone measured but firm. "While I understand the emotional connection between Mr. Carter and his daughter, the court's primary concern is the child's stability and long-term welfare." James's heart sank. He could feel the decision coming, like a storm cloud looming over him. Given the financial disparities between the two parents and considering the concerns raised about Mr. Carter's past, I believe that granting full custody to Mrs. Rebecca Carter is in Sophie's best interest at this time. A wave of shock and disbelief washed over James. He had known it was a possibility, but hearing the words out loud hit him like a punch to the gut. He glanced over at Sophie again, but she was looking down at her hands, avoiding his gaze. Rebecca, on the other hand, sat smugly, her lips curving into a small, satisfied smile. James stood up abruptly, unable to sit any longer. "Your Honor, please, you can't do this," he pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. "Sophie is everything to me. She needs me. I can be the father she deserves." The judge sighed, his expression softening slightly. "Mr. Carter, I don't doubt your love for your daughter, but this decision is final. You will be granted supervised visitation rights, but primary custody will remain with Mrs. Carter." James felt the room spinning. Supervised visitation? How had it come to this? He was a good father. He had always been there for Sophie, taking her to school, helping her with homework, tucking her in at night. Now, Rebecca was going to take all of that away. As the court session ended, James walked out of the courtroom in a daze. Dana followed closely behind him, her face a mix of frustration and sympathy. "I'm sorry, James," she said softly. We did everything we could, but the system isn't always fair. James nodded, but he couldn't bring himself to respond. His mind was too focused on Sophie, on how he had just lost the most important thing in his life. Outside the courthouse, Rebecca was already ushering Sophie into a sleek black car. James quickened his pace, calling out, "Sophie! Sophie, wait!" Rebecca stopped, turning to face him with a raised eyebrow. "What is it, James?" "It's over. You heard the judge. I just want to say goodbye to her," James said, his voice strained. Rebecca sighed dramatically but nodded. Sophie stepped out of the car hesitantly, looking up at her father with wide, questioning eyes. James knelt down to her level, forcing a smile despite the pain tearing him apart inside. "Hey, sweetheart," he said gently. "I just want you to know that I love you. No matter what happens, I'm always here for you." Sophie's eyes welled up with tears, and she threw her arms around her father's neck, clinging to him as though she never wanted to let go. "I love you too, Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. James held her tightly, his heart breaking with every passing second. He wanted to tell her everything would be okay, but he didn't know if that was true. All he knew was that this moment, this fleeting embrace, might be the last time he felt close to his daughter for a long time. Rebecca cleared her throat impatiently, tapping her foot. "Sophie, we need to go." Reluctantly, Sophie pulled away, wiping her eyes. "Bye, Daddy." James watched as she climbed into the car, and as Rebecca drove away, he felt like a part of his soul had been ripped out. Dana placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "We'll keep fighting," she said firmly. "There's always a chance we can appeal." James nodded, though the words felt hollow. He didn't know how he was going to keep fighting when everything seemed so hopeless. As the sun set behind the courthouse, casting long shadows over the steps, James stood there, staring at the empty street where Rebecca's car had disappeared. He had lost the custody battle, but something deep inside him told him that the fight wasn't over. He couldn't give up, not when Sophie needed him the most. And then, as he walked away, a memory flashed in his mind. A vague recollection of an old document he and Rebecca had signed years ago. It had something to do with their marriage, maybe even their future as parents. Could it be important? Could it change everything? With newfound determination, James vowed to uncover the truth, no matter what it took. James sat on the worn leather couch in his small apartment, surrounded by piles of unopened bills and court documents. The ticking of the clock on the wall was the only sound in the room, each second feeling like an eternity as he stared at the legal paperwork that had just robbed him of his daughter. He hadn't eaten, hadn't slept, and couldn't seem to focus on anything other than the crushing weight of losing Sophie. But as his mind drifted back to that moment outside the courthouse, the memory of the old document he had signed years ago nagged at him. There was something important there, something that had felt insignificant at the time but might now hold the key to getting his daughter back. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became. James grabbed his phone and dialed Dana's number, his lawyer who had been with him through this grueling process. She picked up after a few rings, her voice cautious but caring. "James? How are you holding up?" "I'm not sure," he admitted. "But, Dana, I think I remembered something. Do you remember when Rebecca and I first got married? We signed some kind of agreement about what would happen if we ever split up. I didn't think much of it then, but could that help us now?" Dana was silent for a moment, clearly thinking. "A prenuptial agreement, maybe?" she said, her tone thoughtful. "It's possible. If you signed a document like that, it could outline custody arrangements or financial agreements that might change things." James's heart skipped a beat. Where would we find it? If it was filed with the court or a lawyer, there should be a copy somewhere. I'll start digging. In the meantime, do you have any idea where you might have kept your copy? James thought hard, scanning the memory of their early marriage. Rebecca had been meticulous about paperwork, more so than him, but she had insisted on keeping a lot of their important documents in a locked box in their house, back when they were still living together. "I think I know where it might be," James said, his voice filled with hope for the first time in weeks. "There's an old lockbox at the house. I'm not sure if Rebecca still keeps it, but it's worth checking." Dana hesitated. James, if that document is at her house, you're going to need permission to go there and retrieve it. If you try to get it without her knowing, that could look bad in court. James nodded, feeling the reality of the situation weigh down on him again. He knew Dana was right, but the idea of asking Rebecca for anything felt like an impossible task. Still, he couldn't let his pride stand in the way of getting Sophie back. "I'll figure something out," he said, "but keep looking on your end too. This might be our only chance." After hanging up, James stared at his phone for a long time. The idea of calling Rebecca twisted his stomach into knots. She had made it clear that she wanted him out of Sophie's life, and the thought of having to grovel to her made him sick. But for Sophie, he would do anything. With a deep breath, James dialed Rebecca's number. It rang several times before she picked up, her voice cold and clipped. "What do you want, James?" He swallowed hard. "Rebecca, I need to ask you something. Do you remember the lockbox we used to keep in the closet when we were married? I think there's something important in there. Something from our divorce paperwork that might help with this custody thing." Rebecca's silence on the other end felt like a punch in the gut. He could almost hear her calculating her response, deciding whether or not to give him anything. Finally, she spoke. "Why should I help you with anything? The court's decision is final, James. You lost. It's over." James clenched his jaw, fighting the anger rising inside him. "It's not about me. It's about Sophie. I just want to make sure I did everything I could for her. Please." There was another long pause before Rebecca sighed heavily. "I don't have the lockbox anymore, James. I got rid of it when I moved. Whatever was in it is gone." James's heart sank. You got rid of it? Are you sure?" "Positive," she said, her voice colder than before. "Now, if you're done wasting my time, I have things to do." With that, she hung up, leaving James standing in the middle of his apartment, holding the phone to his ear as if it could somehow bring the answers he desperately needed. He sank onto the couch, running his hands through his hair. If Rebecca had thrown the lockbox away, then where else could that document be? His mind raced through possibilities. His old storage unit, maybe a forgotten file at his mother's house. Could be anywhere, but there was no time to dwell on what might be. James stood up, determination flooding back into him. He couldn't afford to give up, not now. Sophie was worth every ounce of effort he had. The next day, James decided to check his old storage unit on the edge of town. It had been years since he'd even visited the place, let alone gone through the contents. The thought of rifling through dusty old boxes wasn't appealing, but the idea of finding something that could change the course of the custody battle pushed him forward. As he unlocked the storage unit and pulled open the heavy metal door, a wave of dust greeted him. Inside were boxes stacked haphazardly, a few old pieces of furniture, and items from a life he barely remembered. One filled with promise before everything fell apart. He sifted through box after box, tossing aside old clothes, forgotten photo albums, and childhood mementos. Hours passed, and with each empty box, his hope dwindled. Finally, just as he was about to give up, he spotted a small, battered briefcase shoved in the corner beneath some old furniture. His heart pounded as he dragged it out into the light. He opened it with trembling hands, and there, lying at the top, was an envelope marked Prenuptial Agreement. James ripped it open, his eyes scanning the legal jargon until he found the section he was looking for. His breath caught in his throat as he read the words. In the event of a separation or divorce, custody of any children will be shared equally, regardless of financial circumstances. The document was signed by both him and Rebecca. It was ironclad. James's mind raced. This was it. This was the document that could change everything. Rebecca had lied in court, knowing full well that they had agreed to joint custody. And now, with this in hand, James had a real shot at getting Sophie back. But as he held the document in his hands, a new thought struck him, a darker one. Why had Rebecca fought so hard to keep this document buried? What was she hiding that made her so desperate to win full custody? As James stood in the dusty storage unit, the weight of the truth began to sink in. This wasn't just about a custody battle. There was something much deeper going on. something that Rebecca had gone to great lengths to conceal, and James was determined to uncover it. James sat at his kitchen table, the prenuptial agreement spread out before him like a lifeline. The air was heavy with anticipation, and his mind raced with possibilities. This document was his key to challenging the court's ruling and getting Sophie back. But there was something darker lurking beneath the surface. Why had Rebecca fought so ruthlessly for full custody? What was she hiding? He grabbed his phone and dialed Dana's number, his lawyer, with trembling fingers. She answered on the second ring, her voice sharp with focus. "James, did you find anything?" "I did," he replied, his voice tinged with a mix of triumph and unease. "The prenuptial agreement clearly states that custody should be shared equally, no matter what." Rebecca knew this, but she never brought it up in court. Dana was silent for a moment, digesting the significance of what he'd just said. "That's huge, James. If we can prove this, it could change everything. But I don't understand why she'd keep it hidden. Unless what?" James asked, his heart pounding in his chest. "Unless there's something else she's trying to cover up," Dana said, her voice cautious but firm. "We need to be careful. If she's gone this far, there may be more skeletons in her closet." James felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The idea that Rebecca could be hiding something even worse than her manipulation of the custody battle hadn't occurred to him before, but now it made sense. He had to know the truth, no matter how painful it might be. "I want to confront her," he said, his voice hardening with resolve. "I need answers." Dana paused. "I understand that you're angry, James, but confronting her right now might not be the best idea. She could twist this against you, and we don't want to give her that kind of ammunition. Let me handle the legal side of things." James knew Dana was right, but the frustration gnawed at him. He had been patient for too long. His mind was a storm of thoughts and emotions, but the need for answers was overpowering. After hanging up, he sat in silence, trying to collect his thoughts. Then, almost without thinking, he began searching online, looking up any information he could find about Rebecca's life since their divorce. He combed through social media profiles, old news articles, and anything that could give him a clue about what she was hiding. Hours passed, and just as he was about to give up, something caught his eye. It was a local news article from years ago about a man named Mark Walker, a real estate developer in the city. The article was a brief mention of his involvement in a financial scandal that had destroyed several families' savings. Nothing directly linked to Rebecca. But then James saw the picture. Mark Walker arm in arm with a woman. That woman was Rebecca. James's pulse quickened as he stared at the screen. The man in the article was someone Rebecca had never mentioned during their marriage. Why had she kept this part of her past hidden? And how was this tied to her fight for full custody? Determined to dig deeper, James followed the trail. He learned that Mark Walker had disappeared shortly after the scandal, leaving his victims and investors high and dry. Some believed he had fled the country, while others suspected foul play. But the connection to Rebecca was undeniable. She had been involved with this man before their marriage, and now she was keeping their history a secret. What if this wasn't just about custody? What if Rebecca was trying to protect herself from something far more dangerous? James couldn't sit still any longer. He grabbed his jacket and keys, his mind spinning. He had to confront her. This wasn't just about his daughter anymore. It was about uncovering the truth. As James drove across town to Rebecca's new house, his thoughts raced. Sophie's well-being was all he cared about. But now it seemed like the person who should be protecting her the most, her mother, was involved in something sinister. He parked his car outside Rebecca's suburban home, taking a moment to steady his nerves before walking up to the front door. Rebecca answered after a few knocks, her face immediately tensing when she saw him. "James," she said, her voice icy. "What are you doing here? We've got nothing to talk about." "I know about the prenup," James said, cutting straight to the point. "You've been lying this whole time, Rebecca. The court should have known that we agreed to joint custody. Why didn't you tell them?" Rebecca's expression barely faltered. "That's not your business anymore, James. You lost in court. I'm Sophie's mother, and I'm going to do what's best for her." "You're doing what's best for yourself," James's voice rose, anger and frustration boiling over. What does this have to do with Mark Walker? For the first time, Rebecca's composure cracked. Her eyes widened, and a flicker of panic crossed her face before she quickly masked it with anger. You don't know what you're talking about. I saw the pictures, James pressed. You were with him. What happened? Rebecca, what does he have to do with this custody battle? Why are you trying to cut me out of Sophie's life? Rebecca stepped back, her face pale. You don't understand, she whispered. You have no idea what's at stake. Then explain it to me, James demanded. Because right now, it looks like you're willing to ruin my life and take our daughter away from me to protect some dark secret. I deserve to know the truth. Rebecca was silent for a long moment, her eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. Then, with a sigh, she stepped aside, opening the door wider. Come inside, she said quietly. James hesitated, sensing the weight of what was about to unfold, but he followed her inside, ready to hear whatever she had been hiding all these years. They sat in the living room, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Rebecca looked exhausted, as if carrying the secret had worn her down over time. She finally spoke, her voice low and filled with regret. Mark Walker was my first love, she began, her eyes staring off into the distance. Before I met you, before Sophie, I thought he was everything I ever wanted. But then he got involved in that real estate scam. I didn't know what he was doing at first, but when I found out, I tried to leave him. He wouldn't let me go. James listened in stunned silence, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. He threatened me. James, Rebecca continued, her voice trembling. He said he'd destroy me if I told anyone, so I stayed quiet. Then, when the scandal broke and he disappeared, I thought I was free. But after all these years, he's come back. What do you mean, he's come back? James asked, his blood running cold. Rebecca met his eyes, her voice barely a whisper. He found me, James, and he's threatened to come after Sophie if I don't do exactly what he says. James's heart stopped. Everything, the custody battle, the lies, the manipulation, was because Rebecca had been trying to protect Sophie from this man. A man she had once loved but who had turned into a nightmare. I couldn't let him take her, Rebecca said, her voice breaking. I thought if I had full custody, I could keep Sophie safe. I didn't want you involved because I thought it would just make things worse. James sat back, his mind reeling. The entire time, he had thought Rebecca was fighting for control, but she had been fighting for survival. And now he realized they were both in danger. We have to stop him, James said firmly. We can't let him do this to Sophie. Rebecca nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. I know, but how? As they sat together in the house that once held their family, James and Rebecca faced a truth that was more terrifying than either of them had imagined. They were going to have to work together, like they never had before, to protect their daughter from a threat that loomed closer with each passing day. James and Rebecca sat in tense silence after her shocking confession, the weight of her words still hanging heavy in the air. The revelation of Mark Walker's return, this man who had vanished after his fraudulent schemes, sent a chill through James. The very idea that Sophie, their innocent daughter, could be at the center of this was unfathomable. But now there was no time to dwell on the past. They had to act. We can't let him control us like this, Rebecca, James said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. We have to take this to the police. Rebecca shook her head violently, her eyes wide with panic. You don't understand. Mark has connections. He always finds a way out. If we go to the police without solid evidence, it'll only push him further. And then, she trailed off, her voice cracking with fear. James clenched his fists, frustrated by the situation but knowing Rebecca wasn't exaggerating. Mark Walker wasn't just some low-level conman. He had orchestrated an entire scam, ruined lives, and disappeared without a trace for years. Now, he had surfaced, using their daughter as leverage to manipulate Rebecca. We need to gather proof, James said after a long pause, trying to remain calm. We need something solid to show the authorities. I won't let Sophie live in fear. I won't let you live like this either. Rebecca's face softened slightly, her eyes showing the first glimmer of hope. "There's one thing," she admitted. "I have a few old emails and messages he sent me back when we were still together, back before everything went dark. They could tie him to the scam, but I never had the courage to use them. I was too scared. If he found out..." James leaned in closer. "Where are they?" "They're on an old hard drive I kept locked away in a storage unit," Rebecca said. "I couldn't bring myself to get rid of them, but I also couldn't look at them. I was too terrified of what they represented." James nodded firmly. "We're getting that hard drive. It's the only way to take him down." The next day, James and Rebecca drove in silence to the storage facility on the outskirts of the city. It was a cold, gray afternoon, and the tension between them was palpable. Despite their shared history, they had never been partners like this before. Their relationship had always been strained, even before their divorce. But now, united by their love for Sophie and a common enemy, they were forced to trust one another. Rebecca parked the car in front of the aging, rusted metal units. "It's in here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated before stepping out of the car, as though crossing the threshold into the storage unit would reignite all the old memories she had buried for so long. James watched her, feeling a pang of sympathy for his ex-wife. She had endured so much fear and pain while trying to protect their daughter. He hadn't seen it before, blinded by the bitterness of their separation. But now everything was different. They walked up to the storage unit, and Rebecca fumbled with the keys, her hands trembling. After a few tries, she managed to unlock the door and pull it open. The inside was dimly lit, filled with boxes of old clothes, furniture, and memorabilia from their past life together. "Where is it?" James asked, scanning the dusty boxes. Rebecca pointed toward a small, battered safe in the corner. "It's in there. I kept it locked up all these years." They worked together to move aside some boxes, and Rebecca knelt in front of the safe. She took a deep breath before unlocking it, as if she were opening a Pandora's box that held all of her darkest secrets. When the door finally swung open, there it was, the hard drive. Rebecca picked it up carefully, her fingers brushing the worn metal casing. "This is it," she whispered. "Everything Mark ever sent me. The proof of who he really is." James felt a rush of adrenaline. They were one step closer to exposing Mark for the manipulative, dangerous man he truly was. But as they turned to leave, the sound of a car pulling into the storage facility sent a chill down their spines. "Did you tell anyone we were coming here?" James asked urgently, his voice low. Rebecca shook her head, fear flashing in her eyes. "No one." James peered out of the storage unit, watching as a sleek black car parked a few rows down. A man stepped out, tall, with dark hair and an imposing presence. It didn't take long for James to recognize him. It was Mark Walker. "Rebecca," James whispered urgently. "It's him." Rebecca's face drained of color. "We have to go," she breathed. "Now." They quickly and quietly moved deeper into the unit, trying to avoid being seen. But it was too late. Mark had already spotted them. "I know you're here," Mark called out, his voice booming through the empty rows of storage units. "You can't hide from me, Rebecca. Not anymore." James's heart raced. He motioned for Rebecca to stay quiet as they huddled behind a stack of boxes. Mark's footsteps echoed closer, his voice filled with malice. "You really thought you could steal from me? That you could hide forever?" Mark taunted. "I gave you everything, Rebecca, and this is how you repay me? By running to your pathetic ex-husband." James clenched his fists, anger boiling inside him. He had to protect Rebecca and Sophie from this monster, no matter what. Mark's footsteps grew louder as he approached the open storage unit. James knew they couldn't stay hidden much longer. He quickly scanned the room, spotting a heavy metal pipe leaning against the wall. He grabbed it, his grip tightening as he prepared to defend Rebecca. Suddenly, Mark rounded the corner and spotted them. His eyes darkened with rage. "You think you can take me down with that little piece of evidence?" Mark sneered. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Before Mark could make another move, James stepped out, holding the pipe defensively. "Stay back," James warned, his voice steady but filled with fury. "You're not going to hurt her or Sophie." Mark chuckled darkly. "Hurt her? I'm not here to hurt anyone, James. I'm just here to get what's mine. And if that means tearing apart your lives to do it, I will." "You've already destroyed enough lives," James said, his voice growing louder. "You've used people, manipulated them, ruined families. It ends here." Mark smirked, his arrogance unshaken. "You're a fool, James. You think you can beat me? You're just a washed-up father who couldn't even keep his family together." That was the final straw. James swung the pipe with all his strength, aiming for Mark. But Mark was quicker than he looked. He dodged the blow and grabbed James by the arm, twisting it painfully. "You're out of your league," Mark growled. Rebecca, still clutching the hard drive, watched in horror as the two men struggled. She knew that if Mark got his hands on the evidence, everything would be lost. Summoning all the courage she had left, she ran toward them, screaming. "Leave him alone!" she shouted, her voice filled with desperation. Mark turned, momentarily distracted by Rebecca's cry, giving James just enough time to shove him off. Mark stumbled backward, losing his balance and crashing into a stack of boxes. Breathing heavily, James stood over Mark, his eyes blazing with determination. "Get out of our lives," James spat, the metal pipe still clenched in his hands. "If you ever come near Sophie or Rebecca again, I will make sure you regret it." Mark, realizing he was outmatched for the moment, sneered one last time before scrambling to his feet. "This isn't over," he hissed before turning and retreating to his car. He sped out of the storage facility, leaving James and Rebecca standing in stunned silence. They had the hard drive. They had the proof. But now the danger was real and closer than ever. Later that night, back at James's house, they sat in the living room, the hard drive on the coffee table between them. They knew the next step was to turn everything over to the authorities, but the threat of Mark still loomed large. "Do you think he'll come after us again?" Rebecca asked quietly, her voice trembling with exhaustion. James put his arm around her, offering what comfort he could. "We won today, Rebecca, but we have to be ready. We're gonna bring him down. And when we do, he won't be able to hurt anyone ever again." Rebecca nodded, leaning into James's embrace, knowing the road ahead was still filled with uncertainty. But for the first time in years, they had hope. And together, they would do whatever it took to protect Sophie, and finally put an end to Mark Walker's reign of terror. The morning light crept through the windows of James's house, casting long shadows on the walls. It had been a tense and restless night for both James and Rebecca. Mark Walker was still out there, and despite their small victory the day before, the threat remained palpable. But today was the day they would go to the police. The hard drive with the incriminating evidence was ready, and they were determined to bring Mark down once and for all. Sophie, blissfully unaware of the chaos surrounding her, played quietly in her room. Her innocent laughter echoed through the house, a bittersweet reminder of why James and Rebecca were fighting so hard. They couldn't let Mark destroy the life they had rebuilt for her. James paced the living room, the hard drive clutched tightly in his hand. "Are you ready?" he asked Rebecca, who sat nervously on the couch, her fingers tapping rhythmically on her knee. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear but also a glimmer of hope. "I don't know what will happen next, but we can't live like this anymore," she said softly. "We have to stop him." James nodded. "We will. This is the end for him." He turned toward the door, but before he could take another step, there was a knock, a sharp, insistent rap that made both of them freeze. They exchanged a tense glance. "Who could that be?" Rebecca whispered. James cautiously approached the door, peeking through the peephole. His heart sank when he saw a man in a suit standing on the front porch, flanked by two others. These men weren't from the police. They had the look of lawyers, cold, calculating, and all business. James opened the door cautiously. "Can I help you?" The man in the middle, clearly the leader, stepped forward, flashing a brief, insincere smile. "Mr. James Carter?" he asked, his voice smooth and professional. "Yes, and you are?" James responded, his guard immediately up. The man reached into his briefcase, pulling out a thick envelope. My name is Martin Ellis. I represent Mark Walker. I believe you're familiar with him. James's stomach twisted at the mention of Mark's name. What do you want? Martin handed him the envelope. I'm here to inform you that Mr. Walker has filed for full custody of your daughter, Sophie. He believes that you and Ms. Reed are unfit to provide a stable environment for her, given the circumstances. James stared at the envelope, unable to process the words. You're lying, he said, his voice shaking with anger. He doesn't care about Sophie. He's just trying to manipulate us again. Martin's smile didn't waver. Mr. Walker has every legal right to pursue custody. He's been very clear about his intentions to provide a better home for your daughter, away from the chaos you and Ms. Reed have brought into her life. Rebecca, who had been listening from the doorway, rushed forward. You can't do this, she shouted. He's a criminal. He's dangerous. Martin raised an eyebrow. If you have evidence to support those claims, I suggest you present them in court. But until then, we have the upper hand. I'd advise you both to prepare yourselves. The hearing is in 3 days. Without waiting for a response, Martin turned and walked away, his colleagues following closely behind. James and Rebecca stood frozen in the doorway, their world crumbling around them. The next 3 days were a blur of panic, desperation, and sleepless nights. James and Rebecca scrambled to gather everything they had: the hard drive, old messages, even witnesses who could testify against Mark. But they both knew it wouldn't be enough. Mark had money, connections, and the legal system often favored those with power. The morning of the custody hearing arrived all too quickly. James felt a knot of dread in his stomach as they entered the courtroom. Mark was already there, sitting confidently beside his team of lawyers. He wore a smug expression, as if he had already won. As the hearing progressed, Mark's legal team painted James and Rebecca as unstable, irresponsible parents. They twisted every detail of their lives to suit their narrative. Rebecca's past with Mark, James's financial struggles after the divorce. It was a carefully constructed web of lies, and it was working. When it was their turn to present the evidence, James handed the hard drive over to the judge, hoping it would be enough to expose Mark for who he really was. The courtroom was silent as the judge reviewed the contents. But after what felt like an eternity, the judge looked up, his expression unreadable. I'm afraid this isn't sufficient, he said, his voice calm but firm. While the information on this hard drive is troubling, it doesn't directly tie Mr. Walker to any current illegal activity. Without concrete proof of his intent to harm the child, I can't base my decision on speculation. Rebecca gasped, her face pale. But you don't understand, she pleaded. Mark is dangerous. He'll destroy our lives. He'll destroy Sophie's life. The judge sighed. I understand your concerns, Ms. Reed, but my decision must be based on the law. It was over. James felt his heart shatter as the judge began to issue his ruling. But just as the words custody to Mark Walker were about to leave his lips, a loud voice interrupted the proceedings. Wait! A woman rushed into the courtroom, out of breath and disheveled. I have something you need to see. Everyone turned to look at her. It was an older woman, with gray hair and a nervous but determined expression. She held up a folder, waving it in the air. The judge frowned. Who are you, ma'am? My name is Lydia Walker, the woman said, her voice shaking. I'm Mark Walker's mother, and I have a document that will prove everything. The courtroom buzzed with confusion as the judge motioned for her to approach. Lydia handed the folder to the judge, her hands trembling. This was hidden in my son's old files. I found it last night. It's a record of all the illegal deals he's made. Everything he's done to scam people, to hurt them. He can't be trusted with Sophie. He can't be trusted with anyone. Mark shot out of his seat, his face contorted with rage. Mother, what are you doing? He shouted. You're lying. But Lydia stood firm. I'm telling the truth, Mark. I should have done this a long time ago. You've hurt too many people, including me. The judge quickly scanned the documents, his expression growing more serious with every page. "This changes everything," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of the revelation. In the end, Mark was arrested on multiple charges of fraud, extortion, and conspiracy. The hidden document Lydia had brought to light was the final nail in his coffin. James and Rebecca were granted full custody of Sophie, and their nightmare with Mark Walker was finally over. As they left the courtroom, James turned to Lydia, who stood quietly in the corner, tears in her eyes. "Thank you," he said softly. "You saved us." Lydia nodded, wiping her tears. "I'm sorry for everything my son put you through. I hope you can find peace now." James and Rebecca walked out of the courthouse, hand in hand, with Sophie skipping beside them. For the first time in years, they felt free from the shadow of Mark Walker, and free to start a new chapter in their lives. The battle was over and they had won. But more than that, they had rediscovered their strength as a family, and no one could take that from them again.